From buses to trains to underground subways, millions of Americans rely on mass transit to get around. These public systems are not only convenient and affordable, but help reduce traffic congestion and our reliance on cars. This, in turn, cuts carbon emissions that have a negative effect on the environment. Across America, each mass transit hub looks a little bit different. A classic Chicago picture often includes a CTA train that's running above ground over the city's roads and bridges. Travel further east, and New York is famous for its very large and historic subway system that opened in 1904. It has the most stops of any subway, with close to 500 stations in operation. While New York's subway is almost 120 years old, it doesn't hold the title as America's oldest. This distinction goes to Boston, where the Tremont Street subway has been running since 1897. This subway is part of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, known as the MBTA. The agency manages the nation's oldest subway system, commuter rail, as well as bus and ferry routes. It's the fourth busiest public transit system in the country and has faced many highs and lows in recent years.
New equipment, old equipment fails in terms of equipment and political will and funding, but also some successes in those same areas. Like many pieces of infrastructure across our country, public transit in Boston is something that isn't consistently funded or politically supported or consistently maintained to the level that we'd all would like it to be.
That's Steven Beaucher, an expert on mass transit and the author of Boston in Transit, Mapping the History of Public Transportation in the Hub. Beaucher says that, similar to many mass transit agencies across the U.S., Boston has long been struggling with how to deal with aging infrastructure, shortages in staffing, and a lack of funding. Add on top of this the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to millions of dollars of lost revenue for the city.
The pandemic affected, as it did with most transit systems across the country, if not the world, led to massive decreases in ridership, depending on what month. Up to 90% of riders did not use the system. But there was federal money that was used to keep the system going, limping along, so to speak.
Throughout the pandemic, Boston was one of the few cities to keep most of its routes running. While ridership hasn't fully bounced back yet, city officials are set on restoring the MBTA to its former glory. After all, this framework paved the way for many mass transit systems that came after it. Rewind back to the 17th and 18th centuries, and Boston was a bustling city filled with dusty, clogged streets. Most residents either walked or hopped on a small ferry to traverse the different boroughs separated by water. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century that private companies began pushing bigger build-outs.
I'm talking about steam trains developed in Europe in the 1820s. By the 1830s, Boston is now reaching out to the suburbs with steam train routes, all operated by independent companies. And then by the 1850s, that's the middle of the 19th century, we start to see the arrival of rail to street transit. So they take what the private companies that were operating coaches throughout the city of Boston for the 18th into the 19th century, they took those coaches, put them on wheels, and they used those for steam railroads. And then eventually that led to horse cars in the streets, pulling coaches, early horse cars along rails in the street.
By the late 1800s, the streets of downtown Boston were teeming with streetcars and carriages.
Imagine all of Greater Boston, all the streetcar traffic was focused in a small area near Scully Square and Boston Common. And you had to take your streetcar in and then come back out if you were going through the city. There was no rapid transit system yet, no elevated rails, no subway. So the subway was a thing of necessity, and it is the first public transit subway in the Western Hemisphere. It's one of the first handful that were constructed in the world.
And there were many challenges in building this first underground subway system. Boston had already existed for more than 200 years, and architects and engineers had to place the subway in a suitable area.
So essentially, the subway was built under public streets and under Boston Common, the two places that were least likely to disturb existing private property and buildings. The technologies we used were, I'll call them cutting edge for the time. They're old school now, but they basically, most of the places was called cut and cover. They would dig a hole, put the subway down, and then put a roof on it and put the street back. But granted, this subway was, when it's completed, all of its pieces, it's a mile or so, a mile and a half long. It's not an entire network of subways that we would envision today, but it was essentially dug by hand and using horses. There were some steam shovels, but it was basically a lot of backbreaking work in the center of the city. A lot of people were upset about the subway as it's getting built. They didn't want all the disruption.
But by the project's end, the new subway was seen as an engineering marvel. It reduced street traffic and allowed travelers to get across the main commons. The technology was a success, and the construction of more lines, both underground and above ground, quickly took shape.
It's interesting to look back on the actual virile excitement that people had when a new line opened. For example, when the Cambridge-Dorchester line opened here in Boston, that's our red line now today, the first train left Harvard, people were screaming and yelling and having a great time. When the first streetcar descended into the subway, it was 3 times over capacity and people were hanging off the sides of it. This is a time when you could ride an open streetcar into a tunnel and just hang off the side.
As much of the larger U.S. dove into a building boom in the 20th century, Beaucher says that Boston acted as a blueprint for many other mass transit systems.
The Boston Elevated Railway Company that I mentioned before was internationally recognized as a leader in new technologies. They brought our first buses to Boston in the 1920s. Other cities came here to look at it and learn from us.
Today, each transportation hub across the U.S. looks a little different, but the end goal is the same: to provide safe, affordable, and reliable travel. While ridership may wane and grow, there will always be a need for public buses, trains, trams, and ferries. To find out more about the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority and mass transit in general, head to viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out Steven Beaucher's new book, Boston in Transit, Mapping the History of Public Transportation in the Hub, now available online and in select bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This story was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. This segment is brought to you by Lowe's. Springfest is here at Lowe's. Save big when you buy 5 bags of premium mulch for just $10. Shop Lowe's today, because Lowe's knows spring. Valid through April 12, excludes Alaska and Hawaii. Selection varies by location, while supplies last.
Coming up next week.
It's really clear from long-term bird banding records that the timing of bird migration is changing. Spring migration is getting earlier and earlier over time.
The changing patterns of bird migration. Then,
I had only acted up until that point of getting my first apartment and emancipated at 14, and I didn't have a domestic skill to save my life.
We speak to the one and only Drew Barrymore. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.